Day. Yesterday, in my program, I discussed the political crisis in Kiev, the attempt by President Zelensky to remove from his position the military commander of Ukraine's armed forces, General Zaluzhny, and the fact that this attempt to sack Zaluzhny appeared to have miscarried in some form. Well, I said that this was the biggest, the most sustained attempt, the most serious attempt that Zelensky has made up to this point to get rid of Zaluzhny. And I said that we came very close to a blowout in Kiev yesterday. And for proof of the latter, well, all you have to do is go to the Western media over the last 24 hours. For the first time that I know of, the media in the West, the Financial Times, The Economist, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, even parts of the American media have been talking about this story. They have been talking about the fact that Zelensky tried to sack Zaluzhny and that in the event, Zaluzhny remained in place. In fact, we've had a relatively detailed account of what happened in The Economist, and this is perhaps unsurprising that the information was set out in The Economist, because bear in mind, it is The Economist to which Zelensky, other Ukrainian officials have regularly given interviews, and what gets the sense that The Economist especially has strong sources in Kiev and access to all of these people, including perhaps first and foremost General Zaluzhny himself. Now, before I proceed, I'm going to say that it is extremely ominous sign for Zelensky indeed that the Western media is covering this story. Up to this time, there's been no real hint in the Western media that there is a crisis between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. In fact, I remember that over the course of Zaluzhny's interview with The Economist in the autumn of 2022, The Economist actually denied that there were any tensions between Zelensky and Zaluzhny at all. Now it's out there in the open that there are not only tensions between these two men, but that one is Zelensky is trying to sack the other, which is to say Zaluzhny, and Zaluzhny is resisting. So Western readers, for the first time, are informed about the fact that a political crisis is now existing in Kiev. And this is a disaster for Zelensky. It is also, again, telling Western readers, including the very informed and politically influential people who read all of these newspapers, that Zelensky's position is coming under challenge in Kiev itself. Now, before I proceed, let's actually try and piece together a little more clearly what happened yesterday. And I say that because I think we now have a reasonable amount of information that enables us to form a clearer view of what took place. It seems that Zelensky and Zaluzhny had a meeting. It seems that over the course of that meeting, Zelensky asked Zaluzhny to resign. It seems that Zaluzhny refused to resign or write out a letter of resignation. An astonishing fact in itself. Here we have a military official refusing a request from his commander-in-chief to resign. Trust and confidence between the two has collapsed, and yet Zaluzhny insists on remaining in post. Apparently, Zaluzhny did tell Zelensky that he accepted that the president, which is to say Zelensky, has the right to choose the people he wants to work with. So, in effect, Zaluzhny told Zelensky, I'm not resigning, I insist on remaining in post. If you want to sack me, then go ahead and try. And Zelensky told Zaluzhny, well, in that case, take it as read that you will be dismissed over the next few hours or days. Apparently, over the course of these discussions, presumably in an attempt by Zelensky to sweeten his request for Zaluzhny's resignation, he offered Zaluzhny two other posts. Firstly, he offered Zaluzhny the post of Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council in place of Zelensky's long-standing civilian political ally, Alexei Danilov. Now, I should say that this is an important post in the defense and security establishment. However, Zaluzhny rejected it, presumably because accepting this position as Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council would end Zaluzhny's direct contact with the military officers in command of troops on the battlefronts. So Zaluzhny rejected that proposal. And perhaps it ought to also be said that, as I understand it, the chair of the National Security and Defense Council is none other than Zelensky himself. So, of course, if Zaluzhny were to accept this position of Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, he would be directly subordinate to Zelensky, which, as overall military commander, as chief of the general staff, he is not. His immediate superior is not Zelensky, but the Minister of Defense, Rustem Umerov. Anyway, after Zaluzhny rejected this offer, Zelensky made a further offer. He offered Zaluzhny an ambassadorship, presumably in some Western country, and again, Zaluzhny rejected that offer. At that point, the meeting ended with Zelensky telling Zaluzhny, fine, I'm going to make a formal decree dismissing you. Expect that will be enacted over the course of the next few hours. And then, of course, things began to happen. Within a very short time, reports about Zaluzhny's sacking were circulating in Kiev. The people who were reporting this news were members of the Ukrainian parliament, aligned with the former president, Petro Poroshenko. Now, over the course of the last few months, it's become increasingly clear that some kind of an alliance has been developing between Zaluzhny and Poroshenko. Poroshenko has never forgiven Zelensky for defeating him in the last presidential election in Ukraine, and it's been fairly well known that Poroshenko has been intriguing with the military in order to try to get Zelensky removed from office. So anyway, these MPs connected to Poroshenko went around circulating stories about Zaluzhny's imminent dismissal. And then something critically important happened, because Zelensky had to delay the announcement of Zaluzhny's dismissal, because the person who he had resolved to put in Zaluzhny's place, Kirill Budanov, apparently informed Zelensky's office that he no longer wanted the job. He was not prepared to take over from Zaluzhny as Chief of General Staff. So it was not intervention from the military commanders, at least not that we know of, and it was not information from the, it was not an intervention from the United States that prevented the announcement of Zaluzhny's dismissal. It was an intervention from Budanov. Budanov told Zelensky that he was not prepared to take over from Zaluzhny. And that left Zelensky in an impossible position. He couldn't go ahead with Zaluzhny's dismissal because he had no one to put in Zaluzhny's place. And of course, the one thing you cannot do in the middle of a war is have a situation where the military are left without someone to lead them. So the result was that the announcement had to be postponed. The defense ministry then became itself the target of rumors. Rumors were circulating that the Ukrainian defense minister, Rustem Umarov, a political ally of Zelensky's, had also either resigned or been sacked. The defense ministry put out a statement saying that these reports were untrue. It was unclear whether this statement from the defense ministry pointed to, was seeking to dispel rumors that Umarov had been dismissed along with Zaluzhny, or was simply confirming that Zaluzhny himself had not been dismissed. And anyway, in the further hours, Zelensky's spokesman, Nikiforov, came out and said that it was not correct that Zelensky had yet dismissed Zaluzhny. So it was Budanov, in effect, who blocked the whole change of position, the sacking of Zaluzhny, because he wasn't prepared to take over from Zaluzhny. And it seems that over the next few hours, long into the night, Zelensky brought together his team and they discussed what to do, whether there would be any other general who could be relied upon to take over from Zaluzhny. There's some suggestions that there's now talk again about asking General Syrskyi to take over, and, well, we'll see what happens. Now, this is a disaster for Zelensky, and I think this needs to be made absolutely clear, because Zelensky has attempted to assert his authority over Zaluzhny, and in the most public way now, in ways that have been made public to the world and to the West, he has failed. He has proved unable to sack his own senior general. And on top of that, the man that he was relying upon to take over from Zaluzhny, the person whom he was relying upon to bring the military to heel, Budanov, seems to have refused. He seems to have told Zelensky it's not what he wants to do. Budanov, by the way, was very busy yesterday, reminding everybody that he's still around. He gave an interview in which he said that the current Russian offensive will peter out in the spring, and that after that it'll be Ukraine's turn. They'll be able to go back on the offensive again. A ridiculous statement altogether, one, by the way, which completely contradicts the policies of the United States. They want Ukraine to remain on the defensive throughout this year. But of course, the real purpose of Budanov's interviews was not to tell us about what's going to happen over the course of this war. It is to remind everyone that he's still there, that he's still the intelligence chief, that there may be a crisis in Kiev swirling around Zaluzhny, but that he, Budanov, is not going anywhere. Now, I'm going to suggest that this is absolutely now a pre-coup situation. In fact, I would go further, and I'm going to say this. Unless Zelensky is able to resolve the situation, and resolve the situation in the only way possible, which is by sacking Zaluzhny and putting another general, finding another general, be it Syrskyi, Budanov, or whoever, to find another general who's prepared to take Zaluzhny's place, then we are at the effective end of Zelensky's time in power. In my opinion, there's a strong chance, a very strong chance, that Zelensky himself will be out in a couple of weeks' time. If he can't sack Zaluzhny, if he can't find a general prepared to take Zaluzhny's place, then it will be a clear sign that he has lost control of the military, that he's no longer in a position to exercise his primary function as president, which is to give orders to military commanders, and that, in effect, his loss of power is so total that he will have to go. And I can't help but think that this is precisely where we're heading. At some point, we're going to see a demand from the military and from other people within the Ukrainian political establishment telling Zelensky that his time is up. He must now go. We are closer to that type of, in effect, coup situation than we have ever been. The fact that Budanov, far from working with Zelensky to bring the military to heel, seems, if anything, to be going over to the other side, strongly suggests to me that Zelensky is in the process of losing control. Now, if all this is what happens, if at some point over the next few weeks it is Zelensky rather than Zaluzhny who is obliged to step down, who is going to take Zelensky's place? Well, in some respects, what will have to happen in that case will depend, presumably, on the provisions of Ukraine's constitution and law, or so one would think. But, as I recall, back in 2014, after President Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, was forced to step down as a result of the Maidan events, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, proceeded to elect an interim president. And his name was, as I remember, Turchanov. He exercised power for a few weeks until elections were called, elections which Petro Poroshenko duly won, at which point Poroshenko became the president of Ukraine. Now, That entire process was, in my opinion, if you read the Ukrainian constitution, straightforwardly unconstitutional, but it was the one that was followed. And I cannot see why, if Zelensky is forced to step down, the same procedure, the same process might not follow again. And who would then be the person to take over from Zelensky? Well, it might be General Zaluzhny, though I have to say, I think that is unlikely. I think that for the moment, Zaluzhny probably does not want to be the president of Ukraine, dealing with political and economic problems, of which he has probably little knowledge or understanding of. I suspect that the person who would be asked to step in as Ukraine's interim president would be Zaluzhny's principal ally amongst the political leaders who that would be presumably former President Poroshenko, who, as we know, has been intriguing against Zelensky for some time. So he would become interim president, presumably at some point thereafter there would be elections. Poroshenko would stand in those elections. He'd probably be elected because, frankly, in wartime, any elections that take place are going to be of a very circumscribed nature, and Poroshenko would be back in charge, and Zelensky would have been packed off. Now, how is that going to change the situation on the battlefronts? The answer is it's not. It's not going to make any difference to the battlefronts at all. As to what Poroshenko thinks he could achieve as president, well, he is an extremely skillful political intriguer and wire puller. His record as president was disastrous, at least in my opinion, also in the opinion of the Ukrainian people, given as shown by the fact that he was overwhelmingly defeated by Zelensky in the last presidential election. And if the idea is that Poroshenko might be the right person to negotiate some kind of deal with the Russians, Poroshenko did once negotiate a kind of deal with the Russians. The deal was the Minsk II agreement, which he signed, but as he has boasted, an agreement which he never honored. I cannot imagine that the Russians would trust him again. In fact, I have to say that a political crisis of this kind, an effective coup of this sort, far from stabilizing the situation in Ukraine, is probably going to intensify the crisis and the eventual inevitable collapse. I can't also help but think that it is going to undermine further support for the Ukraine project in the West amongst Western publics. They've been told for 2 years that Zelensky is this heroic figure, this person who has led Ukraine in this tremendous struggle, this David and Goliath struggle against the Russians. And it would seem to them that this person, this heroic figure, has been shuffled off the stage in a most complicated and inexplicable way. And I can't help but think that that would deepen the skepticism and cynicism about Project Ukraine, which already exists. But there we are. That's where we have come to in this crisis. Zelensky, in my opinion, has only a relatively short time to sort this out. His term as president officially ends in March. Perhaps that's the time point beyond which it will be difficult for him to remain in office if he hasn't resolved the situation with the military by then. And in my opinion, the only way that he can do that is if he now manages to get strong support from the United States and from the other Western powers, sufficiently strong support in order to persuade the other figures within the Ukrainian political system that since Zelensky is the man who continues to have the West's backing, there is no alternative but to stick with him. Anyway, that's my analysis of the situation. I think, as I said, that a particular important line has been crossed as a result of the events which took place yesterday. This is, as I've said previously, an unsustainable position. This conflict between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, one or the other has to win over the next few weeks. At the moment, it seems to me that it is Zaluzhny who holds the advantage. We will see what Zelensky is able to do. Anyway, to repeat again what I was saying yesterday, none of this would be happening were it not for a increasingly bad situation on the battlefronts. And as it happens, over the course of the last 24 hours, we got more news from the battlefronts, and all of it, without exception, has been bad for Ukraine. Firstly, more reports of further Russian advances in the Kupiansk area, even some reports that the Russians are advancing towards this supposedly strongly fortified village of Peshenia and are prepared to push on beyond that to the Oskol River. There's been further reports of big Russian advances in the Liman area, and perhaps most damaging of all for Ukraine, a gathering crisis apparently for the Ukrainian forces in the Bakhmut area. In every place that I've just mentioned, it's clear that the Ukrainians are still just about hanging on, but the Russians are advancing in some places several kilometers at a time now, and in the Bakhmut area, one gets the increasing sense that the situation is now starting to approach, if not outright collapse, anyway, a critical point at which the Ukrainians may decide that they have no real option but to withdraw all their forces west of the Chasov Yar Canal and abandon their positions in Bogdanovka and Ivanivska and other places like that, and accept that the battle for Bakhmut is once and for all and truly lost, and consider now what steps they can take to defend Chasov Yar itself, a place which, as I remember, a Ukrainian soldier said last year, was all but undefendable, despite the fact that it is on high ground, and which apparently, if the Russians control Bogdanovka, would be very difficult to defend indeed. But anyway, a very, very difficult situation for the Ukrainians on the battlefronts. And I would add that it's not just Bakhmut. We've now had further news from Avdiivka. It seems that the Russians are continuing to make further advances within Avdiivka itself. Budanov, when speaking about the fact that the Russian offensive is going to peter out in the spring, is presumably again gambling on the effect of the Rasputitsa, the spring mud season. And it is likely that, yes, the spring mud season will slow or bring to a stop Russian military offensive operations in at least some areas. But in urban areas, in Avdiivka, where the Russians are now well established inside Avdiivka itself, in the Bakhmut area, where the Russians have taken positions in Bogdanovka and perhaps in Ivanivska, that simply does not apply. If the Russians want to continue offensive operations in these areas, in the urban settlements, they can. The place, these villages and towns have metal roads, buildings, they can still move. It's not like trying to move troops across swampy, waterlogged fields. Well, the same, I suspect, applies in another area which is now also becoming very critical for the Ukrainians, which is Marinka, the Marinka area. The Russians still seem to be moving gradually forward in Georgievka, this village to the west of Marinka, but they seem to be also very close now to completing the full encirclement of Novomikhailovka. There's been some uncertainty as to what exactly has been going on in Novomikhailovka, but there's been more reports from that part of the battlefronts as well, and it does seem as if the Russians have achieved significant advances around Novomikhailovka, aimed at encircling this village. All of these Russian advances in the Marinka area are now putting pressure on Ukrainian positions in Vugleda. If Novomikhailovka, Pobieda, Kurakhovo, all of these places are captured by the Russians over the next few weeks, which is now starting to look possible. Ukrainian defenses in Vugleda will collapse, and there is even a report which suggests that the Russians are now coming very close to bringing one of the main supply roads to the Ukrainian garrison in Vugleda under fire control. In other words, that they will soon be in a position to start shelling that road, interfering with Ukrainian supplies to the troops in Vugleda. So, a potential collapse for the Ukrainians in Vugleda, in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, conceivably in the Kupiansk and Liman areas. And again, we've now received more reports from other places as well, places on the battlefronts that have previously been fairly quiet. There's been reports that the Russians have now reactivated their forces in the Vremivka salient area. There was apparently a significant armored advance in the Vremivka salient area, and that the Russians seem to be rapidly moving towards gaining control of much of the territory that they lost in the Vremivka salient area over the course of Ukraine's summer offensive, ultimately reversing all Ukrainian gains there as well. And there's also reports that the Russians are now fighting once again inside Robotino, trying to gain control of this village, this famous village in the Zaporozhye region, which the Ukrainians struggled for so long to capture. And, well, of course, that would be a major psychological blow for the Ukrainians as well, if the Russians are able to re-establish full control over Rabotino. So a very, very bad situation on the battle lines. And Dima at the Military Summary Channel made a point that in several of these attacks, in the Kupiansk area, in the Liman area, and especially so in the Vremivka salient, the Russians launched advances with, well, relatively small groups so far as I can see, of armored forces, armored vehicles. Usually we're talking about 5 or 6 armored vehicles, usually 2 or 3 tanks and 2 or 3 infantry fighting vehicles moving forward. The tanks open the way, the infantry fighting vehicles then bring forward the infantry carries out the assault, that captures the particular location. Usually, as I said, it's about a platoon or a company at a time. We're not talking about big armored fists in any part of the battlefronts, except that it does seem that the attack in the Vremivka salient did involve a rather bigger armored attack. Supposedly up to 20 armored vehicles was involved. Well, all of that is very interesting, but it does beg a number of very interesting questions, which is, how is it possible for the Russians now to do these things? Well, there's 2 explanations. Firstly, Ukrainian shell hunger, the fact that the Ukrainians are now so short of artillery means that the Ukrainians can't shell Russian armor as it advances towards them, which has made it easier for the armor to advance. But also, there does seem to be a general reduction in Ukrainian drone activity. Now, Dima at the Military Summary Channel made the point that in the Bakhmut area, the Russians appear to be engaging Ukrainian forces with large numbers of kamikaze drones, FPV drones, Lancet drones, all these sort of drones. They appear to be doing severe damage to the Ukrainian forces. Whereas Ukrainian FPV drone strikes, at least based on what we are seeing from the Ukrainians, at least what they're claiming, Ukrainian drone strikes are now becoming increasingly few and far between. Now, my impression is that this is basically true, or becoming more and more true, everywhere across the battlefronts, except, interestingly, so far in the Kherson region, where the Ukrainians are still able to operate large numbers of FPV drones in the Krinky bridgehead area, which is the one fact which appears to be preventing the Russians from finally clearing this bridgehead. Everywhere else, gradually, the Russians seem to be getting on top of the problem of FPV drones. And I think that it's unsurprising. In fact, I've been hinting at this or discussing this in previous programs, precisely because Ukraine is becoming so dependent on FPV drones and other types of kamikaze drones, given the severe artillery shortage and indeed the shortages of other munitions. The days when Ukraine had unlimited numbers of Javelin anti-tank missiles, for example, seem to be well and truly past. There is now a global shortage of Javelin missiles. Just saying. Well, given that Ukraine is now having to depend so heavily on FPV drones, it's entirely unsurprising that the Russians would be focusing heavily on finding counters to these FPV drones. And in the Bakhmut area specifically, they seem to have been largely successful in neutralizing the threat of Ukrainian FPV drones. And I'm going to suggest that gradually, as the equipment that the Russians are using starts to be disseminated across the battlefronts, we're going to see the Ukrainians finding it more and more difficult to operate FPV drones and other kamikaze drones on the battlefronts to the extent that they have been doing now. And I'm going to suggest that probably more than one method is being used by the Russians to counter these FPV drones. Undoubtedly, jamming is playing a significant role. The Russians, by all accounts, are becoming more adept at jamming drones, Ukrainian drones. And this is been a long-standing pattern throughout the conflict, and we're seeing it being applied in a more effective way. But I suspect also that the Russians are becoming more successful in shooting these drones down. And there is one particular system which, judging from a recent report from the Russian Ministry of Defense, might be the one that is playing a disproportionate role in shooting down these drones. And I gather that it is not the Panzer system, even though we do have updated versions of the Panzer operating on the battlefronts, but rather it is the Tor, a point defense system. Unlike the Panzer, this is not a combined missile cannon system. It uses short-range missiles, but it's a well-established system, been modernized by the Russians repeatedly. It's very well suited to shooting down drones, and I suspect that the Russians are distributing more and more of these on the battlefronts. Now, of course, undoubtedly, a Tor missile, guided missile, is more expensive than an FPV drone, so there is a cost-benefit calculation to be made. But if FPV drones are the weapon that is preventing the Russians continuing their advances, well, you can see why they might be cranking out more and more Tor missiles, which, as I understand it, are relatively simple missiles, relatively easy to build, and why they're being used increasingly to shoot down these drones. Anyway, this is to some extent a guess, but as I said, the Russian Defense Ministry went out of its way in a recent report to say that the Tor missile system was the best system of its kind in the world. That's actually what the Russian Defense Ministry said. And why would they say that? Why would they be talking up the effectiveness of a short-range surface-to-air missile system unless it was being used in an effective way on the battlefronts in Ukraine now? And what more effective way would that be than by shooting down these FPV drones, which over the last few months have been causing the Russians so much trouble? Anyway, that's a deduction. There might be other things that one can say as well. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. The Russian advances are intensifying, and the Ukrainians are finding it more and more difficult to hold them back We still are not in a situation of an all-out Russian offensive, but the Russians are increasing the pressure. The Ukrainians are burning up their reserves. They're finding it more and more difficult to plug the holes, and we see breaches in the lines now starting to appear. There's a very serious one in the Liman area. There's a crisis in Bakhmut. There's a crisis in the Avdiivka area as well. And before long, we could be seeing a crisis in the Vremivka salient and Marinka areas too. And it's difficult to see how the Ukrainians this time can plug the gaps. Anyway, that's where we are. Now, the Russians, of course, are also operators of FPV and kamikaze drones. Indeed, they operate them on a much bigger scale than the Ukrainians do. One of the frustrating things pointed out many times by Brian Belletti is that in the media, especially in the West, we tend to see reports about the sort of things that the Ukrainians have achieved, the fact that the Ukrainians have succeeded in, blowing up a Russian tank with a kamikaze drone, or have managed to get a drone, a long-range drone, to attack a particular oil refinery somewhere in Russia. We get an awful lot of reports about this, and they tend to circulate in the media in the West. There's usually vivid pictures of these attacks, and they attract a great deal of attention. This disregards the fact that the Russians are doing this kind of thing to the Ukrainians much more and on a far bigger scale. If you were to count the number of FPV drone attacks that the Russians do and compare them with the amount of FPV drone attacks that the Ukrainians do, my own impression is, and I say this, this is my impression, but my own impression is that the Russians are doing this much more, on a much bigger scale than the Ukrainians are. I've seen some suggest that in FPV drone attacks, the two sides are roughly even, and that the Ukrainians have the edge in terms of the fact that their drone operators are said to be better. My own opinion is that the Russians decisively overtook the Ukrainians in terms of FPV drones some time ago. And if I'm right, and the Russians are successfully jamming and shooting down Ukrainian FPV drones, the imbalance will of course grow, and we're already seeing signs of that. And of course, inevitably, the Ukrainians will try to counterbalance what the Russians are doing. They will try, for example, to make their FPV drones and other drones more jam resistant, more resistant to Russian jamming. And they will also try to jam the Russian drones as well. And there are reports that within the Ukrainian army, there is now an increasingly wide distribution of simple jammers which Ukrainian soldiers are using against Russian drones. So it's important to understand that this technical battle is going on all the time. But it is also important to understand that because the Russians operate industrially and technologically on a completely different scale to the Ukrainians, when the Russians move ahead in any particular area, in numbers of drones, in numbers of drone operators, in jamming, the Ukrainians will have to run to keep up. And over time, they're going to find it increasingly difficult to do so. That is a simple product of resources. If one side has far more resources than the other, over time, the increased resources of the one side will prove decisive over the side that has the fewer resources. And that is what we're going to see. We've seen that already with artillery, with drones, with armored vehicles, with all of these things, with anti-tank weapons, with mines. And I'm going to suggest that the reason we're now starting to see Russian armored offensives take place, though still on a very limited scale, we're able to see Russian tank columns move without interference. I saw that happen about a week ago in the Avdiivka area, and we're starting to see Russian tank columns move again, apparently without interference, in the Vremivka salient area. The reason we're starting to see this is because the Russians are gradually getting the edge in artillery, in drones, in jamming, in all of these things. And Ukraine's ability to redress the difference is going to erode further and further over time. That is the reality of industrial power. Now, we've had more information about this and about the discrepancies between the two economies. The IMF has now upwardly revised its guesstimate of Russian GDP growth in 2023. At one point, they were talking about a minor contraction. That was last year. That was in 2022. They were predicting that the Russian economy would contract in 2023. Then, as I well remember, they revised their estimates. They at one point said that Russian GDP would grow by 0.3%. And that already caused some dismay in the West, admitting that the Russian economy was moving into a growth trajectory in 2023 instead of a contraction trajectory. Then they started to give numbers for Russian growth, GDP growth in 2023, which were higher than the 0.3 expansion that they originally suggested. Now they're admitting that Russian GDP growth in 2023 was at least 3%. By the way, this is, as far as I'm aware, the highest upgrade in growth rates of G20 economy, well, that I've seen for a fair amount of time. It suggests that the IMF has lost its information about the Russian economy, which, by the way, doesn't surprise me. Importantly, the IMF is now predicting that Russian growth, GDP growth this year in 2024 will be 2.6%. They're anticipating a much lower growth rate in 2025 of, I believe, 1.2%. Not clear why. They think growth will fall so sharply in 2025. Perhaps they're simply saying that in order to keep their Western donors happy. Who knows? But this year, they're predicting a 2.6% growth rate. Now, the Russian government itself currently claims that GDP growth in Russia in 2023 was 3.5%, already higher than the IMF's estimate. But the latest data discussed recently in a meeting between Putin and the officials of the economic bloc of the Russian government, apparently the latest data suggests that actual GDP growth in Russia in 2023 might have been as high as 4%, a full 1% higher than the IMF reckons, which might mean, doesn't necessarily follow that it will mean, that growth this year will again exceed the IMF's estimate. They're estimating 2.6%. Perhaps it could be more than this. The Russian banking sector has just recorded, as I understand it, record profits for 2023, which suggests that there's plenty of money in Russia at the moment to invest. And what is driving growth at the moment in Russia, more than anything else, is an investment surge fueled by a demand surge. The Russian central bank is trying to slow demand because of the uptick in inflation, but it's likely, what is possible, that investment will continue to remain high despite the higher interest rates. I understand that the way investment works in Russia means that investment in production, in the productive side of the economy, is not as affected by higher interest rates as it would be in the West. So possibly we're going to get higher growth rates in Russia in 2024 than the IMF expects. Well, that will, of course, increase the problems, the difference between the Ukrainian economy and the Russian. According to the Financial Times, Ukraine needs at least $37 billion of external financing in 2024 in order to cover its budget needs. That is looking increasingly problematic. If it doesn't get enough money from the West, then inflation will presumably increase. And of course, there's a risk that Ukraine will be obliged to resort to money printing with the disastrous inflationary consequences that that will have. And it's anyway difficult to see how growth can be sustained beyond that. Some people have been seizing on the fact that Ukraine has been able to export grain through the Black Sea, and are saying to themselves that this is providing Ukraine with some external financing. It is, but the figures are dwarfed by those in Russia. And in the meantime, we're getting further news about further huge increases in Russian armaments production. Now, armaments production in Russia increased steadily in 2022 and 2023, but it's clear to me that at the end of 2022, when the Russian leadership realized that this war was not going to end quickly, that there wasn't going to be a negotiated resolution to the war, the Russians took a decision to invest heavily to expand military production. And this took the form of enlisting extra workers, and Russia has a massive pool of trained workers and engineers. Just saying that they took steps to increase factory space. They probably bought more machine tools and that kind of thing. And it seems that at the end of 2023, all of these investments began to bear fruit. So I've discussed how Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has given figures for the rate of increase in artillery production. And I suggested that what he's actually indicating is a huge jump in production of artillery shells and probably artillery pieces, as guns and that kind of thing, at the end of 2023, a 17-fold increase, supposedly, and over the levels of early 2022. And in fact, we now have, I think, fairly clear confirmation that the Russians are producing at least 4 to 5 million artillery shells a year at the moment, that this is the current rate of production. We've had now further reports from the Russians about missile production. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has just visited the Novator factory, production complex in the city of Yekaterinburg in the Urals. Novator makes many types of missiles, including Kalibr missiles for the Russian Navy. These are subsonic cruise missiles that participate in the missile strikes, are used in the big missile strikes against Ukraine. He was told that production of missiles, Kalibr missiles, increased significantly last year, but that Novator plans to double production in 2024 above the level that had been achieved in 2023. And supposedly, production in January of Kalibr missiles saw a 17% achievement of the 2024 plan. In other words, in January, Novator produced 17% of the Kalibr missiles it was slated to produce in 2024, which, if true, suggests that Novator is probably going to exceed the plan. It's going to build more Kalibr missiles in 2024 than it was ordered to, and that, of course, is a number that is at least double that of last year. Now, that's one factory, and of course it might be that Novator is not going to be able to sustain that level of production throughout 2024. Who knows? It could also be that other factories producing other types of missiles are also not going to be able to sustain similar rates of production increase. Shoigu has, in fact, criticized one production team for their delay in completing production and delivery to service of a new artillery system. It's fairly clear that he's referring to the Koalicja 152mm self-propelled gun, which is supposed to take over from the Star B 152mm self-propelled gun, which is currently the standard such gun in the Russian military, fielded by the Russian military. So, this isn't a straightforward or simple thing. It does seem that the Russian army is about to receive its first Koalicja artillery pieces, but clearly this has taken longer to happen than Shoigu was happy with, and he's criticized the chief designer, for the delay. But overall, we are seeing a continued production surge. And there is no reason to think that this production surge, in terms of military equipment, is unsustainable, because it is happening against a background of a wider production surge, continuing production surge within the Russian economy, backed by higher investment. Again, this is not unique to the Russian economy. Anybody, for example, familiar with the history of the American Civil War will know how the economy of the United States, the Union, actually surged during the period of the American Civil War. New production facilities were opened, industrial processes were modernized, infrastructure was developed, all to aid the war effort, and this led to a general surge in economic activity right across the United States, which, by the way, carried over into the peacetime period afterwards. And so this isn't surprising or unusual. There are plenty of precedents for this. But that brings us back to the situation facing Ukraine, because they are struggling at the moment to hold back the existing Russian forces. They suffer from shortages of artillery shells. This is now universally admitted. And they are suffering from, they're probably going to have problems with their drones before long. And it's a long time since I've heard of deliveries of more Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and Western tanks to Ukraine. Some of the Western tanks that we've been hearing so much about, the Challengers and the Abrams tanks, they've never appeared on the battlefronts. And nor, by the way, have the Leopard 1s, or at least not in any number. And I can't help but think that, putting aside the maintenance issues, Ukraine is desperately trying to conserve what limited tank forces it still has, and to the extent that it continues to commit tanks to the battlefronts, it's now increasingly resorting to the old Soviet-era tanks that it still gets from Eastern Europe, and of which it still has a pool itself, supplemented to some extent with Leopard 2s. Well, we can see how attrition works. The Ukrainians suffer losses, which they can't replace. The Russians, increasing their strength all the time, they can not only replace their losses, but they can supplement their existing numbers with more men and more machines. Now, a short while ago, President Putin said that the total number of Russian forces in the zone of the special military operation is in excess of 600,000. And this is, I think, a record. It shows that numbers of Russian troops in the area of the special military operation is increasing, and we're seeing the effect of that on the battlefronts. Shortly before Putin said that, I think at the end of last year, I remember Zelensky saying that the total number of Ukrainian troops on the battlefronts was around 600,000. So there is supposedly, or at least there was, according to Zelensky at that time, according to Zelensky and Putin, rough parity. But it's a parity, obviously, which doesn't say anything much about quality and capability. One senses that the Russian troops are better trained, better equipped, probably significantly younger than the Ukrainian troops. And the Ukrainians are still having problems sorting out their mobilization plan. And their mobilization plan is not only been severely delayed, but the delay has been aggravated by this political crisis in Kiev and by the disagreements between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, with Zaluzhny so far refusing to come to the parliament, as far as I can see, and argue for the mobilization plan effectively there. So there is this problem. Now, Zelensky has now come forward and has given a different number for the number of Ukrainian troops. He says that the actual number is not 600,000, as he said a few weeks ago. He says it's 800,000. He may be right, but I do wonder whether Zelensky isn't double counting and whether perhaps he is plucking out a number which is greater than the number of troops on the Russian side, because up to fairly recently, it was the case that it was the Ukrainians who outnumbered the Russians. And it's difficult for him to acknowledge that there is now rough parity in numbers, and that before very long, with the Russian army growing all the time in size, that parity will be replaced by Russian superiority. Just saying. On the subject of Ukraine's mobilization, Larry Johnson, by the way, on Sonal 21, has made the entirely valid point that even if Ukraine were indeed to call out 500,000 men, they would need to train those men at least to a minimal level. And that would take them many months to do, and it would be months before we were starting to see significant numbers of Ukrainian troops appear on the battlefronts, even at relatively minimal levels of training. So again, we see how attrition works. And I come back to this crisis in Kiev. At some fundamental level, I wonder why they all bother. I wonder why Zelensky is so keen to sack Zaluzhny, why Zaluzhny wants to cling on, why Poroshenko is intriguing against Zelensky. Because it's clear that they're all pointing at each other and blaming each other for the fact that it's all falling apart, but none of them seems able to come up with a plan about what to do. There is no real plan. There is no way, so far as I can see, that you can reverse or change the effect of this attrition. Now, the same blindness exists in the West. I spoke yesterday about how Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign minister, is now effectively admitting that there is no light at the end of the tunnel, that the Russians are still in the war, and that they're still advancing, that they have the initiative. It's the gloomiest statement that he's made, from on top of a succession of increasingly gloomy statements. And then yesterday, having taken an increasingly pessimistic approach about the war, he then suddenly comes out and says, well, actually, we mustn't negotiate with the Russians. There must be no negotiation. Ukraine's victory is of existential importance for the West. So we must carry on until victory is finally achieved. So no negotiations, no real way, however, at the same time, to redress the situation of attrition. And I've discussed, and we've discussed on the Duran, the strong arm tactics being applied to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. It now, however, turns out that the European Union is now only proposing to provide Ukraine with 5 billion euros of military aid this year. Nowhere near enough. It's not going to be remotely close to meeting Ukraine's military needs. And that, of course, simply reflects the exhaustion of European arsenals. And of course, the United States at the moment is not providing, so far as we know, military aid in any significant number at all. And given the deadlock in Congress and the political crisis in the United States, which I've talked about already, with the election pending, it's becoming increasingly unlikely that the United States will provide further aid either, at least certainly not at the levels, military aid, at the levels that we saw in previous years. And apparently the EU, having again tried to strong-arm Prime Minister Orban, they've now suggested that there should indeed be yearly reviews, as Prime Minister Orban has insisted on this 50 billion euro package of financial aid for Ukraine. They're not, however, agreeing that the aid package, that these reviews should allow or provide for any veto by Hungary in the event that the reviews, whatever criteria they have, turn out to be unsuccessful. We shall see whether Orban is prepared to agree to that. If he is, it will be a significant climb down by him. But anyway, we shall see. But anyway, all of these plans, all of these ideas, they again don't address the fundamental issue of the effect of attrition and of the increasing discrepancy in build-ups on the part of these two opposing forces. So all of these political games in Kiev, they're very interesting. They might, as I said, accelerate the inevitable collapse, because if Zaluzhny is sacked, that will demoralize the army. If Zelensky is forced out, that will create severe problems, I suspect, for European governments, and will play probably badly with the US, in the US. It might allow some people in Ukraine to get their hands briefly on whatever spoils there are lying around, not to be underestimated. But it can't change the overall direction. And all this strong-arming and arm-twisting of Orban that is taking place in the West, and all these brave statements by people like Borrell about how negotiations can never be countenanced. Well, again, what ultimate difference is it all going to make? When Orban says it's just throwing good money after bad, he is obviously right. Well, I'm not sure that European leaders or American leaders are really thinking about outcomes in Ukraine anymore. Keeping the process going, keeping the war going for as long as they can, now seems to be the only objective left. Delay the moment of Ukraine's collapse, transfer as much money and have it circulate around the system as is possible, refuse negotiations with the Russians, terrify the European public with all sorts of bizarre stories about how World War III is around the corner. There's now article after article about this. And, well, see what comes. To my mind, the betrayal of Ukraine, because that's what we're looking at, the real betrayal of Ukraine, could not be more complete. This was an avoidable war. Negotiations were possible at many points of it. It doesn't seem as if the political class in Kiev, despite their infighting, are looking at that. The European political class don't seem to be interested in negotiations either. And I get the sense that in the United States, basically, they have decided to walk away from the entire enterprise. Well, there it is. That's where I'm going to finish this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Also, please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And don't forget also that you can check out our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you. More from me soon. Have a very good day.